Good afternoon, good morning, and good evening. Welcome to 365 Deep Dive. I'm Andy Honeycutt. This is John Moore, and today we are joined by some very special guests from all over the world. We have Joanne Klein, Alistair Pugin, and Darrell Webster joining us for our conversation on Copilot Readiness Explained, an experts panel. We'd like to welcome you all to today's show. This is going to be a really fun one. We're really excited to deliver this. The fact that we're all across the world talking about this is pretty exciting, but we're really interested to hear where you're joining in from. Seems like we had a lot of interest for this topic and this conversation, and we're pretty excited to deliver this. So with that, I want to welcome everybody to the show. And how are we doing? How is everybody today?
Hey guys, thanks for joining us.
So we know there's tornado warnings, right? There's tornado warnings.
We're
waiting for the siren.
There's a tornado warning where I live. Okay, so if I leave quickly, you know the backstory.
So Joanne, in Canada, do they have tornado sirens that go off that warn you?
No, I don't often. No, I can't remember that. And in the summers, particularly in the hot months, we can get some pretty wicked tornadoes here where I live. Yeah, it's very flat here, and they really build up some speed.
Yeah. So they'd notify you like via text and things like that then, I guess?
Yeah, like the weather, the weather warning app.
The weather apps
and
stuff.
Warn us, but I've never heard a siren where I live.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, I'm always curious like how other countries and even other states in the US do that. So I'm in Missouri, right in the middle of Tornado Alley, maybe a little bit on the north end. And we have, tornado sirens are at every elementary school and every hospital and things like that. So they're close by everywhere. And they actually test the sirens the first Wednesday of every month at 11 a.m. All the sirens across the state go off at the same time. So they test them to make sure they're in good working order. And we get a few tornado warnings every year. But well,
you probably get
hopefully
more
everything stays all right for you.
Yeah, I do too.
Yeah.
I grew up in a country town where they used the siren that they would call for the volunteer fire brigade. Mm-hmm. That would go out across the valley, and if any volunteer was within earshot, they'd rush off to the fire station. But they would use it every lunchtime to say it's lunchtime.
Oh, so, really?
If we had a tornado or something or a fire,
I would imagine your warning systems are probably mostly for like tsunamis and stuff, right, Darrell?
Oh yeah, if anything.
Yeah.
But how do we get to extreme weather so quickly, and disasters?
Yeah, it's a fascination. Thanks for setting us up.
We're talking about Copilot, right?
Hang on, are you making a comparison there already?
Yeah,
straight out.
I think in our session at Teams Nation, Andy and I had a section that was navigating turbulence with Copilot, and we can see, according to your tagline there, Al, that you're not our Copilot today. So I'm curious what role you think you play in Copilot readiness at this point. Are you on the plane? Are you the flight attendant, or are you air traffic control?
I'm the old man that shouts at the clouds, right? That's me. That's where I am, right? It's that
you're yelling at the
one
plane.
more thing, right? We told you to do that.
Yeah.
And that's my take on, we'll dump into the semantic index and it's lipstick on a pig, right? AI is not new. The functionality is not new that that supersizes the generative side of things. We've been telling customers for 20 years, 24 years actually, to fix their information architecture. Nothing's changed. They've just got a new way to talk to data. That's it. So yeah, I'm the guy going like this, shouting at people. That's why I said I'm not your co-pilot.
Yeah. So I'm curious. So Andy and I, we've talked a lot about our own experience with Copilot. We've been rolling it out in our organizations, but I'm curious from the three of you guys up top, have you worked with organizations yet that are rolling out Copilot? Or are you still in that readiness phase? Have you seen like an uptick in interest in things like security labeling, information architecture, change management that you've been preaching for a long time and people are finally coming around? Or are they full-blown Copilot? You've been working like in the weeds with Copilot already?
I can start with that one. I mean, I have traditionally been very busy anyways on data governance all up. So I'm talking retention and records management and data protection and data retention and data security. And I'm busier now because companies wanting to implement Copilot. Like, I'm not a Copilot expert, but I am an expert in all of those other things that can help them roll out Copilot in their organization. So that's my value prop. And 100%, I think the hard conversations that I've had to have with varying degrees of success over the last years is a lot easier right now because so I'm leaning on that and using that to do the things that I'm good at and that my company does right now. That's been my experience so far.
Okay. Do we go in order every single time? It's Joe, and then it's me, and then it's Darrell, or do we flip it up every single time?
Whoever wants to bring up something.
For Al, because Al's probably going to have some similar things to say with Joanne. Yeah. I'll leave the adoption to last because that's what everyone does.
Right.
I suppose it's a full circle moment for me, right? For the last 24 years, we've been talking to customers about content. Well, we can't say ECM anymore, right? We've got to say content services. We've got to be with the hip crowd. But we've always talked to customers about information architecture, knowledge management, tacit, codified, the codification of knowledge, and your knowledge is an asset, and so forth, so on. Structure your content, and nobody's done it, right? They do a little bit, and then they carry on as before, right? I'm not in Darrell's world, so we birth the baby, and then we like surrogate mothers, and we give it to someone else, and then Darrell comes in, and he fosters the child, and he eventually sees it run off into the forest as an unruly teenager, right? But it's full circle moments for me. When Copilot launched, I had 3 customers say, "Hey, can you come help us with our information architecture?" And it's like, sorry, what did you say? Did you say the words information architecture? And now it matters. Now it matters. It's like, it's just, yes, man, get in. It's only taken 24 years to make information architecture relevant again, right?
Is it fair to say
that's what we've seen? Not even about how good Copilot is. Customers are coming up with their own use cases, which is great. But got a customer saying we've got, I think it was about 100 terabytes of content, and they were thinking about moving it out of SharePoint into either Box or Dropbox. And they were saying, well, one, obviously the problems they're having with OneDrive Sync is because of Unicode path lengths, and they've got stupid folder structures and all of that, And now they want to move it to, they were going to move it to Dropbox because it's a better experience, according to them. But then they heard about Copilot, and it's like, come fix our data. It's like, we were going to move to Dropbox. It's constant. In the old days, we used to talk about SharePoint nightmares, right? It's the same thing now, right? We're going to have Copilot nightmares or information architecture nightmares. It's Google search appliance all over again. And I'm going to stop there.
It sounds a lot like when you're getting ready to move to a new home, and as you're packing up, you discover a box that you never unpacked from like the previous move that's just full of like random stuff that you just didn't have the chance to like go through previously. So you're just picking up that mess and you're moving it into a new storage location, or in this case, moving it from one cloud storage to another.
Yeah,
man, I like that analogy. It's like, I know you probably should say, hey, we haven't used this for the 4 years that we've been in this house now. Do we need it still? Yeah, just in case there's a apocalypse, we might need some box to dive into and make something.
The
back to
random
John's
box
question.
of cables.
Yeah, back to John's question, because I've seen enough debates lately that don't address questions that I'm going to come back to it. Sorry, too fresh. Adoption, actually the question was, am I seeing an uptick, and what am I seeing in general? There are plenty of envisioning workshops that we run, that we help leadership and hopefully the right collection of people to come along and share their opinions, thoughts, and where things might align. They usually get into some kind of identification of scenarios and people who might use this. And I know we'll get deeper into this a bit later on. But yeah, like I think there's still caution in terms of how organizations are approaching this and trying it out, mostly because of it being quite a cost commitment. And they do need to go through an exercise of, well, is this going to be useful for this type of person or this business group, and how might we help them find the most functional, useful things about Copilot? Because I mean, everyone's asking, "Are you ready for Copilot?" But no one's really asking, "Is Copilot ready for us?" Or maybe they're not doing it out loud. So that's kind of where we're at. We are helping them in that early part of the journey and seeing interesting things, which I'm sure we'll talk about throughout this live event.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I want to kind of dive into a little bit later on is that like use case mapping and finding value. And I know that's a big top of mind for a lot of people, is after getting our house in order, how are we going to determine if it's worth the license cost, or who do we give it to? What's the best bang for the buck, if you will, that we can get out of it. I think early on in a lot of people's thinking about going into this new world is that oversharing concern. Like Andy, you brought up the moving boxes and finding these boxes that you've never unpacked, and Darrell's point about like, do we actually need that stuff? Is that something that when you're talking with customers or you're looking in your own organization, is that one of the first steps for you guys that you've been bringing up, is why don't we find the old useless or orphaned data and get that out first, and then talk about like labeling and categorizing and things like that, so that we don't have to process through millions of files that ultimately we find out are throwaway because they've been 8 years that they haven't been touched? Do you think cleanup is a good first step, or do you like to do that kind of sketch out diagram of where things should be?
I'm going to quickly jump in here as we're kind of formulating our answers. So John and I have focused a whole lot on like the how-to with Copilot, and we've purposely kind of avoided the getting your house in order part of the conversation. We kind of wanted to have some experience and get some different viewpoints on that. But I'll tell you, the number one question that I get, especially in like a public forum, for example, TechCon 365, everyone's biggest concern, number one, is oversharing of information and getting that in order before they actually launch and deploy Copilot. So that's what I'm I'm seeing from a lot of different organizations across the board. So as we step into like those answers, we can start with Joanne and talk a little bit about what you're seeing in those lines.
Yeah, for sure. And I'm going to change that. All organizations I work with, it's kind of a Wild West free for all in their SharePoint and Teams environment. And there's, really no data governance in effect. Oversharing, huge one. Unmanaged permissions is a close second, I would say. So getting your hands wrapped around that and fixing that is not a trivial undertaking. And this is why Microsoft's introducing some of these reports and things to help that a little bit. But yeah, that's a huge problem and really the ball game if you want to start using Copilot across your M365 environment, because it's such a big problem. And I think that's a huge task for any organization to implement. It's not quick. That's why they've introduced the restricted SharePoint search. So you don't. It's a Band-Aid, it's a temporary solution, so you don't actually have to deal with some of that stuff. Let's just get this in place first, and then we'll deal with this big effort, in the interim. Like I think the data access governance reports is a big one. But you need to have, I think you need to have E5 or it's a SAM license requirement.
You need,
I don't know. Somebody else correct me.
You need SharePoint Premium. So you need a SharePoint Premium license, and SharePoint Premium as a SKU doesn't exist. So it's actually
or
SharePoint
E5
Advanced
it comes with.
No, it doesn't. Right. It doesn't ship with an E5.
I think it does.
The DAG stuff.
The DAG stuff
I'll
does.
check.
Yeah. I was even going to suggest it comes with an E3, but I could be wrong on that one. But for sure, an E5 is what I thought.
All the DAG stuff. I was actually training SharePoint admin yesterday, and I was comparing two tenants, and I've got SharePoint Premium in my MVP tenant, and then it lights up all the even the stuff under policies, sharing controls, and there's a site lifecycle management one there. That doesn't. That's not there if you don't have SharePoint Premium. Unless I could be completely wrong.
What we mentioned. Yeah, what we mentioned. Andy just put this in the chat if you guys are watching on YouTube. But this is the link to learn more about that restricted SharePoint search that Joanne mentioned.
Yeah.
And Darrell has a good point. It's funny to bring his comment on screen while he's here, but close that door and deal with it later, right? It's the idea of like, let's go with the most restrictive, most closed option, and then onboard things, make things available manually, as we go. And I see that as one of those, like, let's get this removed as a blocker, or like the fear, uncertainty, and doubt of SharePoint as a Wild West. Let's deal with that so we can get our pilot going, and then work on actually addressing oversharing and actually getting a proper information architecture, but not wait like a year and a half to do it and sit on the sidelines for Copilot. So I think Microsoft kind of implemented this. They probably have been working on it in the past, before Copilot, but it's seen as one of those like, oh, this could be not necessarily a silver bullet that fixes everything, but it's something, like you said, a Band-Aid we can put on so that we can at least experience Copilot without taking huge risk.
And I'm just going to jump in there and add to that. One of the things that I think is really critical, I'm putting the link up here, we'll put this in the chat on our social medias as well, is taking an opportunity to actually read how Copilot uses your organizational data. There's a lot of misconceptions out there because people haven't read the instruction manual. This actually comes from Microsoft's data privacy and security article on Copilot. We're going to circle back to this, I think, a few times throughout this conversation. But a lot of people that are asking these questions haven't actually read the documentation around it and have an understanding from that documentation about how Copilot actually uses the data, what the security boundaries are with that your data never actually leaves the tenant, and it's not being used to train the model, for instance. And there's a lot of concerns around that. But I would recommend like starting with the manual, the instruction guide first, to get an understanding of those boundaries before you put up some of those questions, or have some, or to try to ease some of those concerns as you're getting started.
Andy makes a good pilot. He always wants to read the manual, do the pre-flight checklist. I'm like, hey, let's get it in the air. Let's see what it does.
We'll learn to fly the plane while we're in the air on the way down.
Hey, yeah, we call that agile.
Fair comment, though. This is something I talked about recently with a co-presenter at a user group, that it's all coming out so fast that to stay ahead of your customers and try and learn this stuff to be a good guide, it's such a rapid experience that what order are you going to do it? You should be doing what Joanne and Alistair are talking about, and you should have done it years ago. But you've got to close that door, I guess, and deal with what you can safely, learn from that, and then help your customers or help your organization. And look, let's be honest, it's all happening so fast. It's hard to do. What is best practice for something that's only been around for this period of time?
Yeah.
Yeah. One limitation I've heard with restricted SharePoint search does anybody know off the top of their head, is it 100 sites you can apply that to, or 1,000?
100.
It's 100. Okay. Yeah. So it's pretty limited. I mean, my organization's approaching 3 million sites right now. So, it's just, it's not going to work for some, but it'll be a great option for maybe some smaller organizations.
Do you think a better approach would have been to have opt the sites in that we want to be part, rather than opt out?
Well, there is there's kind of two controls at place, right? There's include these SharePoint sites, and then on the it's a different license, I think. That one, not a SAM license, but a Copilot license you need. And restricted content discoverability is a SAM license. So that's kind of doing the reverse thing. But that takes a lot more work, I think. Well, maybe not for your really extremely sensitive sites, but it's kind of tackling the problem from two different directions. Yeah. But I have to tell you, my concern with the restricted SharePoint search is it's really easy to do that in some organizations, and they'll never move off of that. And you won't really get the benefit of Copilot, because it's a lot of work to do all of the other things, sensitivity labels and data loss prevention and insider risk and all of the other things you have to do. So you don't have to just limit it to 100 sites. I mean, those are huge programs in an organization.
So let's say you're trying to get your house in order. Are there any tools, reports, applications that you can take advantage of where you can identify oversharing, where you can identify areas to maybe clean up permissions and sharing links for content, beyond doing things like working with putting the SharePoint restricted libraries in place?
So, you want to take that one out, or who's taking that?
Yeah. That restricting sites from search, right? Because this is a Copilot readiness thing, so I don't want to turn into a Copilot doomsayer, but there are two ways of restricting, blocking the indexing of your environment, right? Because that's all it is, right? Do not index this library, or do not index this site, or you can do the other things on the other side where you're doing it backwards, right? Like Joe was saying, because you want to block Copilot. But the semantic index, which nobody talks about, also gets impacted by everything that you're trying to do. So you're not just blocking Copilot from accessing that environment, search won't work either. And all the coolness that comes with the semantic index, which has been recently introduced into this bubble, also disappears, right? So contextually based content information is no longer there, right? Getting your house in order for all of this, there's a ton of content around Copilot readiness. And if you follow that structure, it's going to take you quite a long time to do all of those things, right? Before you go switch on Copilot. And I don't know. There is no happy medium here. You literally need to say, we're going to rework our information architecture. We're going to start from the ground up and build it that way. We've got 3 customers currently that we've literally had to do that because that permissions, the mess that is permissions in Microsoft 365, or at least SharePoint and Teams, you can't bubblegum and sticky tape that, right? You need to design a whole new permission model, right? With a whole new information architecture model that supports the permission model. And then move your shit data into non-shit areas, and then you can do it right. But this sort of halfway, meet me in the middle thing is not going to work, because you know what's going to happen? People are going to do that, and it becomes a permanent solution. Right? We bubblegum and sticky tape these, HR, finance, and legal is restricted access. Nobody can, see that data, and they just leave it, right? And no, the great guidelines by Microsoft around the procedural thing to actually do it, but we rework. It's like it's a resurgence of information architecture standardization inside of organizations, ones that are actually interested in. If you've got a couple of 100 terabytes, good luck and Godspeed. That's a 3-year project, right? If that. No, there's no easy answer to what you can do straight off the bat. It's not there. You've actually got to take knowledge management seriously. If you want to get the most out of LLMs looking at your data, right?
So I think it's fair to say at this point, it's going to be a multifaceted approach to deal with things like oversharing and what information Copilot can work with. I think there's going to be an enterprise level of that. That's where I think some of the architecture best practices would come into place. I think that's where like some of the purview features would come into place. But I also want to kind of point out that there's also going to be a bottom-up approach to this. There's going to be the actual business unit, the data owner of that, the custodian of the files that has an intimate knowledge of that content. So there's going to be a bottom-up cleanup of that content, as well as an organizational top-down approach. And Alistair, I think to your point, it is going to be something that it's going to take time to accomplish. This is not something that there's a magic switch that you can flip and overnight your environment's going to be perfectly set up for Copilot in the future. Let's kind of put a user adoption spin on that. Darrell, let's say, are there any best practices, any kind of like recommendations you have for like maintaining site hygiene, maintaining like Microsoft Teams, SharePoint sites, and what can like the business units, the users, the site owners, the team owners out there do to help deal with things like oversharing and some of that story?
Well, I think that's part of the challenge. If we're relying on consistent human behavior, it's already going to be a difficult challenge. And that's why Microsoft are putting out and working on tools that try and automate this. And if you get it down to, I guess what we could say is the new metadata, sensitivity labels, you either have the ability to put these on automatically, or you rely on people to put them on themselves. I've worked with customers that's part of the campaign is, hey, we've turned this on, we're cheering you on, you're playing your part to keep this data labeled and safe, and look, we'll take care of the rest once you've labeled it. But yeah, I mean, I can only imagine the challenges to automate that. So coming back to like human behavior and what can people do, sadly we're still relying on people to put stuff where it should be, label stuff the way that it should be labeled, add metadata that may be available. Whoa, you got too many choices for me. You can see the compounding challenges. and it takes, and I want to say this is almost like a theme for how we should be treating our data, but also how we should be working with Copilot, is we need to slow down to speed up. You know, we hear about all these advantages of you're going to save time, you're going to speed up work, you're going to be able to do this and that. But we actually have to step back, slow down, label our stuff, put our stuff in the right place, slow down and think about what we're going to ask Copilot. You know, there's a theme here. And maybe that's in and at odds with the way and the pace of work today. No answers there, sorry.
Well, I mean, we've established it's a complex problem, and it's not something that you solve overnight. My feedback has typically been around specifically the oversharing story. It's a culture thing. You have to establish the culture, and you have to get that right in order to really get this set up in a way that would make everybody happy across all the different departments within the organization. I want to kind of drill down into that a little bit more. So if we go and take a look at maybe the compliance story, Joanne, what are some techniques? What are some ways that you can use the compliance tools in Microsoft 365 to identify and discover overshared content? And then what are some next steps that organizations could take to get ready for Copilot and releasing that to the masses?
Well, overshared content. My head, there's a couple of different controls that are playing in my head. One is, it's not going to solve the whole problem, but sensitivity labels, certainly. Automating that as much as you can across the board. So it doesn't matter, as much where something is stored. If you're automatically applying the appropriate sensitivity label, it is protected to some degree. If you've got that fairly fine-tuned, though. So that's one big thing.
Would you say that would help to kind of alleviate some of the end user responsibility and change some of the people behavior that Darrell was talking about a moment ago?
Yes, 100%. There's a lot of legwork. That's a front-loaded project that has to go into that to make sure you're detecting the right sensitive information, and you're applying or recommending the right sensitivity labels. So, but yes, the whole idea of that is to try to make it easier for the end user to do the right thing. So yeah, there's definitely that. DLP is another big one, data loss prevention, to prevent oversharing. I mean, that's been around forever. This is not a new thing, but it really it is a very good control to have in place, including Copilot. And as a matter of fact, if you go into the new AI hub inside of Purview, it will automatically generate a bunch of policies for you. 2 of them are DLP policies at the endpoint. But you can, there's many DLP policies that organizations have in place today that's helping with oversharing, unintended sharing, that kind of thing, protecting against that. But I don't know if I mentioned it before, those data access, those DAG reports, data access governance, they will highlight anything that you've overshared with those kind of big sharing links. So monitoring that is a good way to at least highlight, wow, we're really oversharing in this particular site. That kind of thing. Site access reviews are coming. Site owners are going to have a lot of responsibility for governing and managing the permissions on their site. So I think some of this is going to get pushed down to site owners to be, good data stewards for the areas that they're responsible for. I think that will help. Different organizations I work with have done that with varying degrees of success. Some do it brilliantly and they've really got good data site ownership, and others don't do it at all. So I think that's going to be a differentiator probably for Copilot readiness as well. So I don't know if that quite answered your question, but those are just some ideas I thought of.
Yeah, it popped a couple of ideas in my mind too of what I've seen done outside of those standard controls and the reporting and things is restricting who can create public sites versus private sites,
Yes.
restricting that so that things aren't overshared by the nature of their public and everybody can see it. So just people don't understand groups a whole lot, I find, and the concept of grouping. Another thing that I see a lot of what we would call oversharing that's inadvertent is, hey, we stood up this team for a project or something like that. You were in the team, you rolled off of the project, but you're still stuck in that team, right?
Yes.
Technically it's still shared with you, but it's not relevant anymore.
Yeah.
Things like, having owners, check your roster in teams and make sure like on a regular basis that's cleaned up, or automatic archiving of abandoned sites, things like that. We used to have to do that with like PowerShell. We used to have to do these things with like PowerShell, scheduled tasks and all of that to clean up. And now Microsoft provides native tools for that lifecycle management.
Well,
so
do they really, and do they really work?
It's not as granular as we used to be able to do. At my old organization, we had several things that constituted what a live group was, and whenever Microsoft rolled it out initially, there was a couple of things that got missed, right? So there was activity, but it wasn't considered activity, so it got accidentally archived, but my hope is it's gotten a little bit more mature over the past couple of years.
No, it hasn't. We've got two customers currently. And the reason why I say this is we've got two customers currently, right? That we're actually building a management layer, one on top of SharePoint, right? And two on top of Teams for this exact thing, right? And we've had to speak to various teams inside of the organization. So when you start talking about security, right, and external access, do we start talking to the security team and that identity team to talk about guest access review policies? Are you going to implement, because there's things that don't happen inside of Teams, Purview, or SharePoint, right? So guest access review policies, right? That happens in Entra ID, right, around identity governance. So it's not just an information manager's conversation. And what we're seeing is that because of IT, the overhead on top of IT to worry about permissions and access and, guest access versus external access versus, hey, I've invited this person to a team and they no longer work for that organization, or they've been offboarded. Now that becomes IT's problem. Or I've shared a file, just the file with someone, it becomes IT's problem, right? And then, you've got Direct Connect and a few other ways of managing that. I've got two customers saying we want to give the permission modeling and the access control back to business. It's got nothing to do with us. And we're using Power Apps and Power Automate as automation jobs to run PNP PowerShell from a provisioning perspective for template creation and template applying templates, That's what we're doing. And we're giving them a console that says you can, as the owner of the environment, it could be a SharePoint site or even a team. We built the interface for them, for the end user, the person, the owner of the team or the SharePoint site, to have that level of modality, right? Where they can say, this team is archived. Or scrub it. We're building this thing called a janitor that's going to go in and do things on the back end. So from the entire life cycle of the team or the site, or the team and subsequent sites, because private channels an entire site, we give that back to business. So they need to worry about permissioning. It's their problem. It's not IT's problem. IT is just giving you these services back where you need to make the decisions around who has access to what, how you're managing it, when do you close it off, what happens to the data when you need to scrub it, and also how you manage sensitivity labels. Give it back to business. And then when it becomes business problem, they start taking it seriously, right? Because it's now their thing. It's not an IT thing that you can log a call or call someone and say, hey, fix my shit. No. It's your problem. Even before we get to Copilot, right? This is really not about Copilot. Copilot's just this cool, hot, shiny thing in the corner, right? Going, look at me, I want attention. But it's great for us, the information architecture people, because we'll be employed gainfully for the next 10 years. Going into organizations and fixing their information architecture, which includes all of those things: sensitivity, retention, data leak prevention, data loss prevention, lifecycle management, security, authentication and authorization, and all the cool things that's rolled up into things like Zero Trust, because there's Zero Trust for Copilot as well. Yeah, it's going to be a wow 3 years as we watch Copilot grow up, right? Because it's not there yet.
So kind of like along those lines, Jason actually brings up a good point, because we're starting to get into the information architecture as it applies to SharePoint sites, Teams channels, share channels, and so forth. With that in mind, how would you mentioned a couple of tools, and I posted a link in the chat around this, around like the guest sharing and the settings there, where you can put some limits on like the external sharing. But from a Copilot perspective, people that use Copilot are within the organization. It doesn't have the ability to connect to data that's outside of the organization. So let's take a look at it from that perspective. How would we manage things like sites and teams if we want to limit the oversharing within the organization? So Joe end user can't pull information from a team or a SharePoint site that's dedicated to our leadership or our decision makers. What are some things that we might need to look at for managing that kind of structure, and the security trimming and like the permissions and controls around that as part of the information architecture?
There is a slew of new reports coming. They're at varying degrees of rolling out, private preview, public preview. The big one that I think talks about what you're referring to is the site access review report. So a site owner, team owner is going to get a report down to the file level on their site, and how many users have access, how many groups, is it anyone access, everyone but external users? All of those things are parsed out, and then they can manage it, the site owner, right from in that UI, and remove the permission if they want. So the onus is going to be on them to do it. But I think it was possible, but a very manual process before to do all of that stuff. So that's I think one of the things that is going to be very helpful to get the internal permissions under control.
Yeah, and on that category of those special SharePoints or SharePoint embeds now, one that Darrell loves bring up any chance we can about Loop. That's another one to not have a blind spot for. We got private channels, we got shared channels, those spin up those kind of headless SharePoint sites. Loop is another one of those to think about as your Loop workspaces in your organization.
Yeah, yep. And what I'm hearing is, because it's a new space of being able to store documents but still have files, but still have the capabilities of SharePoint. We're going to see that SharePoint embed space grow and be used by more and more services that Microsoft creates.
Yeah.
So I know this is a slightly sidestepping the conversation and talking a bit about the challenge of Copilot versus other development, but things like SharePoint embed and teams that are working on that are now having to hurriedly make sure they're providing the tools to meet these challenges that organizations have for Copilot readiness. Where are the admin tools? Oh, they've only just arrived. How long have we had this? Well, about a year, that's the challenge. And SharePoint embed is, at the moment, it's in your environment, but it hasn't been as visible. got the admin tools now to see these well, I say workspaces, but containers. Loop uses it, Designer uses it, there's other services being built to use it. So we need all of those tools to be able to go in and control that. And, at the moment, we're just dealing with things like, can we see it? Can we restore it, delete it? Can we even change ownership? These are all like core, simple features and functions that we expect from any kind of site management. When are we going to also see other things come in to help us manage those spaces too? Because they are quite literally dumping grounds for files.
Well, SharePoint Embedded is, in my opinion, is the future of SharePoint. And I believe in about 5 to 10 years, the current storage structure for SharePoint Online will become SharePoint Embedded for a couple of reasons. One, permission modeling sucks today.
Yeah, it does.
They've never fixed it, right? Then they introduced M365 groups and teams. It's an utter abomination. But if you look at the containerization approach for SharePoint Embedded, I'm excited about SharePoint Embedded because I can go to customers and say, Documentum you have in the building, you've got a many-to-many relationship. I can do crazy shit with SharePoint Embedded and help customers move off Documentum or any other open text product into a headless ECM, and I'm not going to call it content services, a headless ECM platform. And now I can build the role-based access control on top of, the containerization. Yeah. Great stuff coming. And I do think eventually SharePoint Online will move to SharePoint Embedded. But we are seeing it with Loop Workspaces and a few other services that are now starting to consume that. I mean, you can see it in the SharePoint Admin Center. You can't provision a SharePoint Embedded container from the GUI. You have to run some PowerShell stuff. You also need to activate Syntex pay-as-you-go, which is not in the SharePoint Admin Center for SAM, SharePoint Advanced Management, right? And then shit is all over the different admin centers, right? So it's the most bizarre thing. Because it sits in the setup tab in the Microsoft 365 Admin Center. And then you need an Azure subscription that's set to pay as you go, just to switch on these cool things like containers, right? So that you can spin things up. So the license model for SharePoint Premium, which there's no license for Premium, even though they call it Premium, it's SAM, like Joe was saying earlier on. And then you got to configure things, and then it switches other things on, and archiving, which is not really archiving, but it's called archiving. But it's fun. It's exciting times. And I don't really have an answer for what you asked initially because I completely forgot what you asked.
So I think there's a couple of takeaways that I just want to kind of crystallize here for anybody that's like tuning in live or watching this later. Number one, it's going to take a team to really get your house in order to really clean up your information architecture, to get your compliance and data governance in place as you're getting ready to roll this out. For some organizations, that's going to be a pretty long runway for them to do that before they deploy it. I know, having recently done a webinar with ShareGate, some of their studies have shown that I think it's around 68% of their customers are looking at deploying Copilot over the next couple of years. So it looks like they're going to use that runway to try to get their information architecture and their compliance in place before they actually start rolling out Copilot to the masses within the organization. So takeaway, it's going to take a whole team and some effort to kind of get that structure in place. I've seen other organizations where they flip this on and they're like, we're going to figure this out as we go, which is very much the Microsoft approach to deploying Copilot. We're going to build this in the air while everybody's on the plane flying with us. And, we're going to kind of go that route. So there's some challenges to apply there. The other thing, I think another big takeaway is there's not one tool. There's not one magic wand that you can wave to be able to get this in place, because there's different areas, and there's different applications, there's different admin centers that you're going to have to step into. So that's where the team-based approach is going to apply, because different teams are going to have knowledge of different tools. I've seen some third-party tools that have done a pretty good job of putting some of that structure together. But just like if you buy all the different licenses and add-ins, even with a third party, you're going to have to pay for those services in order to take advantage of what they might offer. So those are some considerations as an organization that leadership's going to have to make. And going back to something John mentioned just a little while ago, I'm part of an organization where we tried to build some of our own tools. We rely a lot on PowerShell, a lot of custom Power BI reports to kind of roll our own in an effort to save some resources. It's exceedingly challenging here because of how complex this story is. So if you do try to build your own, you're facing an uphill battle. So and the other thing with that is Microsoft's like, we have a report coming out. I always joke that they're like, we got a report coming out, or we got this new tool or application coming out in the fall. They just don't tell us what year they're referring to with that tool. So it could be, down the line. So those are some things to kind of to think about. As we kind of continue this conversation, there are some things that from an information architecture, Alistair, I'm wondering if you could speak about things like role-based permissions versus like dynamic groups, working with like dynamic security groups, for instance, and using that to kind of set up some access control across the organization. Are there any advantages or disadvantages that you would talk about there?
When we start talking about identity and access management, right? So it's always been the same conversation. Where's your master data for identity, and how do identities get provisioned? And we've got customers that have a third-party product, that sits with HR, and it automatically creates an account inside of Active Directory, because a lot of customers still run Active Directory on-prem, and then that gets synchronized up, right? So when you start looking at identity attributes or intra-ID attributes or Active Directory attributes, you can start using that from a filtering perspective to enable dynamic group membership for groups inside of Microsoft 365. So if you belong to HR and your job title says, or your department says HR, that can automatically add you to a whole bunch of groups based on dynamic group membership, and then that will filter through, right? So again, you're seeing IT handing back responsibility to various departments inside of the organization, saying, you are responsible for making sure that this person has access to data, not IT. It's no longer a help desk or a service desk function, right? And I think that's great for us to understand that. And dynamic groups, it's again, you have to go through an entire modeling exercise around what identity management means to you as an organization. Are you using those custom attributes for the betterment of authorization principles, not authentication principles, authorization principles, and how you can roll that back into business, where if someone moves between departments, they are automatically moved between departments, right? At an IT level. Dynamic group membership gives you that functionality. I moved from human resources to marketing. I no longer have access to anything that's in marketing, right? That's the magic of dynamic group membership in a security group or an M365 group, however you want to spin that up. I do think that that's important. From a role-based access control perspective, you'd have to look at what that actually means, right? I mean, conditional access policies and conditional access app control policies is your friend, right? And I'm sure Joe's got a lot of conversation around, using Defender for Cloud Apps from a CASB perspective, when you start risk profiling users. And it's a big security conversation around identity posture management, right? We know about cloud security posture management, application security posture management. We know CNAP and all the other bits and pieces that come with that, but identity posture management should be a thing, because that's going to govern. At the end of the day, that's the governance, right?
Mm-hmm.
For authentic authorization into specific areas, right? And it's a whole bunch of services that you have to glue together, right?
Mm-hmm.
In 2 seconds. In LiveLink, and the legacy ECM platforms had very elaborate modeling around permissions. Something like LiveLink/content server, so think about permission models in SharePoint. You've got those item level permissions, but the ones that you've always had in the legacy ECM systems was see and see all contents. So you can see that the document exists, but you've got no access to that. And the only way we can mimic that inside of SharePoint is by applying a sensitivity label. So you can see that the document exists, and then it becomes infinitely complex around doing all of these things. You've got to take a simpler approach to permission modeling inside of your content store. And a lot of organizations don't understand that. They literally don't. And then it goes back to how you do identity management and what identity management means. So yes, dynamic group membership, the business needs to understand it, IT needs to understand it, and then HR needs to understand it before it actually can be applied successfully inside of your organization.
So let's take that, and I want to tie it back to Copilot specifically. John, can you speak about how Copilot works with a user's data whenever they run a prompt, or like whenever they run a query inside of Copilot?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we've seen this diagram a couple of times, and it's iterated and matured through, but essentially, whenever you submit a prompt to Copilot, it goes through a grounding or a pre-processing process where it takes that prompt and it looks at across the Microsoft Graph, which is limited to your access, right? So there's an organizational semantic index that gets built, and then there's your semantic index that gets built. And we've seen in the wild that, the reports are about a week, maybe 2 weeks, that Copilot gets significantly better at returning responses and finding relevant information that it didn't find before, about a week or two in. So it's able to quickly, traverse the Microsoft Graph and put, if I say, what's the latest with Tom, and I don't mention anything else, it's able to tie which Tom I work with the most closely, what files we have together, all of that information, and adds it to the prompt to augment the prompt and add context to then send off to the LLM, get a response back. So that's based off of what you have access to, and it's continually, live and up to date. As new files get added to your OneDrive, it becomes aware of it, near instantaneously. I'd notice maybe like a minute or two before it shows up in that recent files area. One nuance that I've heard people be a little bit concerned about, or I don't want to say ignorant about, but misunderstanding about, is those all company links. There's been fear out there about, hey, whenever somebody creates a sharing link and it's everyone at Contoso, is that going to show up for everybody who looks for something that might, hit that keyword? And I saw a great explanation from this from Mark Meraz on the Microsoft SharePoint or Microsoft Stream team, that essentially there's the dumbed down way, or the way that I understand, is that it's almost like a tokening system where you create this link that says everybody in Contoso can get to this file if they get this bespoke, unique URL. But the access token for that has not been turned in for every single user. So because of that, you're not going to randomly get access to that file because you've got millions of these wide open links. The thing that you're more concerned about than random one-off links is group membership, where somebody has access to something via being a member of a SharePoint site that they didn't know they were access to.
Right.
That's how people I've seen are stumbling into information that they didn't know about and get concerns about, not from these, sharing links. And it takes a lot to understand sometimes that like there's two types of links. There's like the direct path to the file, which is group-based access. And then there's all of the, vanity URLs that get created when you do an ad hoc sharing experience.
Right.
So I don't know if that answers the question quite the way that we were going, but I've seen a lot of just uncertainty and fear about, I don't know all of the links that everybody has created. And I'm less concerned about than I am about the sites that maybe you were a member of that you never got cleaned out of, things like that, we've talked about all of the other angles to address those types of things systematically.
Yeah.
So,
or public sites, that's a big vector for that as well, right?
Yeah, and we've had to do some user education, about, hey, we found this thing that was in this site. Did you know that everybody has access to this? And oh no, how do I clean it up? It's an opportunity for learning. Yeah.
So Joanne, you mentioned something I think that's really important there, and I want to spend a few minutes talking about that. And that's actually part of the cleanup, part of the data cleanup in the Microsoft cloud world. It's so easy to hoard data because the limits that you have within your tenants are very, very large. So it's easy for users to just drop everything in there and just kind of forget about it and not go back and clean it up. And one of the things about Copilot, especially leveraging like the semantic index, is its ability to be able to recall and pull that information up. And in some cases, that might lead to pulling up duplicate files when they're trying to do like a query with Copilot and not knowing which one's the version of the truth. But it could also lead to sharing or referencing outdated information. So I think something really important would be cleaning up some of the rot, the redundant, outdated, and trivial information. What from kind of a data governance point of view, what are some things that we can do to clean up some of that outdated and older information?
Yeah, great question. And I know Microsoft's solution for this is retention policies that have a delete component to it. So data lifecycle management inside Purview is deploying that. Even if you start, most common locations I see are starting with Exchange and OneDrive and Teams chats. So getting rid of things after a reasonable amount of time. Reasonable is different for every organization, but doing that in tandem with records management. So identifying those records of business value that you in fact don't want to have deleted, that you're preferring them to kind of feed into the Copilot, that semantic index we were talking about. So that is, again, that's a fairly large project. I mean, you have to be really careful. You can't just slap in a retention policy that's going to delete content after 5 years after last modified, because it's potentially going to get rid of things that you want to keep. So the work there comes in identifying things within those same locations. Automation is the best way to do that. That relies, though, on, in some cases, information architecture to be able to apply the appropriate retention label to keep it for longer. So it's as much a retention thing as it is, reducing your data surface, so reducing your risk as well. I mean, there's a couple different reasons why you would want to do this. It's an insider risk activity, like reducing insider risk. And the data exfiltration, it is, identifying your business records. It's cleaning up your data so you don't have as much rot out there. What else? Yeah, that's what I spent a lot of time with my customers working on. And, they often take kind of a workload approach. Let's start with Exchange, we'll move to OneDrive, move to SharePoint and Teams. SharePoint and Teams is the hardest one because it's a free-for-all usually, and there's all kinds of disparate content that is out there. So the more structure you can put into place over there, at least on some of your locations, makes it much easier for you to automate some of these controls on top of it. That's kind of my initial thoughts on that.
So let's look at it from the other point of view. I'm going to pivot to Darrell on this one. Can you talk about this from like a user adoption standpoint? What are some of the things, considerations that the business units, the owners of the data should consider when it comes to some of that older content and older information? What are some things that they can do to manage that so that they can leverage Copilot in an efficient way once they get access to it?
Just a clarification question. Is it what can they do to help manage the data from it? Because part of what I'm hearing too is the challenge of getting your environment ready and working. You've got amazing tools that Microsoft are building that Al and Joanne are working with to try and automate stuff. But then there's still another layer where we have to hand it back to the business. And that's where you've got your governance and your people who are making decisions, but they don't do that daily. They meet, weekly, monthly, whatever that cadence to go over these things. We build tools. We've got third-party vendors like AppPoint and the like that are building these things to give it back to the business to allow them to make these decisions. But it's like we need this role somewhere in the middle that is savvy enough to understand what that means, but also knows the business well enough to make those decisions for them and with them. And look, I've seen it happen even just at the basic level of, hey, we're giving it back to the business, the responsibility of requesting a user account and filling out the profile and using a certain service to do that. And it can be quite overwhelming. So, I guess there's adoption of the service once we've finally got access to it. But what do we need to help our that middle ground role, that person to make these decisions when everyone really is quite time poor? If we need that level of focus and that level of time to look at reports regularly and say, no, oversharing. I know these people in my group. I'm going to go talk to them. Yeah. I don't know if that was the question, but I think that's a challenge.
You went exactly where I was hoping that you were going to go with that. There are the information custodians, the business owns the data. The business knows the data that they need. They know that they have to keep this for, in number of years based off of retention guidelines, whereas IT or our admins might not necessarily be in the know around that. We might have organization policies that differ with some like regulations. So I think it's important to point out, as you did, that there's going to be that middle level role that has to step in and take some ownership of their data as part of this process. It can't be just a top-down approach. There has to be that middle ground where the business owner, the data owner, steps up and takes some responsibility for that content as we're starting to deploy something like Copilot or take advantage of the semantic index and advanced search features that we have in Microsoft 365.
Yeah, I think some of this is also in a way selling to your organization the idea of doing things differently, or the idea of taking ownership of your data. That middle role could be something like an information architect or a process architect or something like that. And rather than, I like Al's perspective from an IT admin of like, we're going to make this the business's problem. You can't say that to the business or you're going to have a poor uptick. You have to say something, softened to, we're empowering you to handle your data the way that you know best, because we know that you know your business better than anybody, or we're enabling you, right? It's about how you sell your organization on it. And one of the other things that's very difficult, and we've seen this in like Joanne said, Exchange and then Teams chats, and then as like IT becomes the bad guy for like, okay, you've had 10 years of email, now you're going to have 2 years of email. You've had unlimited Teams chat, now you're going to have 30 days or 60 days for, rather than we're taking something away. Yeah, rather than we're taking something away, it could almost maybe be spun in a way of, well, this is going to help ensure that what Copilot comes back with is more relevant and up to
100%.
date and accurate,
Yes.
right? So it's like a little bit, it's in a way of like how you sell. And a lot of ways, Darrell knows this, is your inroads to sell to the organization is by getting your message to your champions and letting them kind of propagate it out, right?
Yeah.
So
remember,
I'm curious.
I was going to add that these are the same people where someone leaves the team and we assign the OneDrive to the manager to deal with the stuff that's sitting in someone's OneDrive. Yeah? These are the same people. Oh, no, I'll get around to it. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
My favorite is when they're like, oh, yeah, it's in our team's OneDrive. Your team doesn't have a OneDrive. You do, but your team doesn't have a OneDrive. We have a SharePoint. Let's put the information there.
Yeah. So Darrell, as you get like, you're activating those champions, or you're figuring like, how do you sell the idea of getting your house in order, but also the idea of Copilot and talking to a computer in a different way. Are you finding that the tried and true methods of like ADCAR or whatever change methodology people ascribe to, are those working, or do we need to kind of take a shift and modernize some of those standard practices to getting people to think differently?
Change, the process of change doesn't change, if I can put it that way. Like, we still need to go through awareness of like, oh, what is this for? Buying into it and getting the desire. Well, that doesn't change. I think what is different about adopting Copilot is, and I've heard this comparison before. It's like going back to sort of the DOS level command prompt, where, or stepping into a room to run a workshop and say, right, we're going to come up with some solutions to this problem. Here's the whiteboard. You start. No, you start. No, you start. Like, it's like going into that room and not sort of knowing where to start. Copilot's different. And if I was going to meme this, I'd grab a frame from There's Something About Mary. There's something about Copilot that's different, and adopting it. It's a challenge. We do have people that definitely pick up on it and grab it and they run with it because they know the language of delegation. They understand that I can write a prompt and I know how to ask someone to do something for me on my behalf and give them examples and, ground them and where to look for that information. And then there are many who don't, who that sort of level of thinking is beyond, and it's quite new. So there's multiple levels here, or I guess angles that are different about adopting Copilot compared to something that's tangible, like, hey, we're going to roll out Teams. This is the menu. This is what you click, and it does this every single time. Going back to it, the journey doesn't change. The tools are still the same. If I can talk about them really briefly, you're still going to have your envisioning session. You're still going to identify the scenarios that are going to be useful to you. But you need to come down almost to that personal level, because Copilot for Microsoft 365 is a personal assistant. So you need to give people the tools to help identify what is going to be useful to them. You've actually still got to circle back to that question of, is Copilot ready for me? What parts of Copilot are ready for me? What is going to work reliably for me to go and use on a day-to-day basis? And, you can go to mature experiences like running Copilot and even Teams Premium to help summarize your meetings. Great. But do always check the results. Don't just depend on, so there's all sorts of these levels and facets of things that we have to think of and consider when going through this adoption and change journey. We'll still use champions for sure. Champions are our people of, they have the knowledge of the business, they have the knowledge of the processes and the things, the opportunities, the challenges that people face in the different areas of how they work. They're going to have better knowledge of, how am I going to use this thing to simplify my work and my job. They're going to also be more likely to share what is working for them and share those prompt patterns or those key things that they've found that work well. So yeah, a very, very sort of long-winded way of saying that the beats and the ways that we use a change management program to help adoption are still the same, but the subject matter is there's really something different about it.
Yeah, there's two things that stood out in my mind. What you were talking about first is I've totally seen that apprehension or concern come from end users who are new to Copilot about you put something into Copilot and it's not like Teams or another tool where you do this and it does that every single time. It's more jazz, right? It's like it freaks people out sometimes to put a prompt in and get two different responses when you regenerate, and it doesn't do the same thing every time, and it kind of scares them a little bit. It's the left-brained of us, the more analytical of us, that kind of like, I don't like that because that's not how computers are supposed to work, right? And then another point that you brought up is the idea that you've seen some people take this and run with it right away, and they seem to almost be naturals. One thing I've noticed, I think over the past, probably forever, middle management has gotten kind of a raw deal of being like in the middle and they just add bloat and what are they actually doing? But honestly, I would posit that your middle management might be some of your best Copilot champions because they are very well practiced and they're very good at getting people to do things and inspiring them to do things. They've been prompt engineering humans as part of their role, right? And the executives, the very executive level, it's like I do like very little instruction and then they go away and do it, right? They're directing, where the managers are more managing and a little bit more hands-on with the iteration with their people who are a little bit, maybe like newer entry-level type people. They're used to that going back and forth and it not being perfect and them kind of guiding the person. That's the same type of idea. And I've found that on the two ends of the spectrum, you end up with like the executive just wants to do more than what they asked for. They want to do one sentence prompt and get back an amazing result. And then the other, the kind of like newer or less experienced group at the other end of the spectrum gets a little bit freaked out by it doesn't do what I expected it to do. But we've kind of found that group in the middle, can almost talk to those other groups about well, here's how you steer a new employee the way that you want them to get the result that you want out of them and inspire greatness. In a lot of ways, you might look at your middle management. It's just something that I've seen that they tend to have the biggest ROI. Also, the middle management people are also the ones who tend to have the most crap on their plate to deal with. So they benefit the most from being able to offload some things to generative AI and get a boost. So just that's two thoughts of things that they popped in my mind as you were talking about. It's interesting that some people just naturally are really good at this and some people struggle. I know it's taken me months and months and I'm nowhere close to as good as, even the novices at prompting.
Well, they have the language of delegation.
So there is a tool where you can literally put in the 10 words and it will generate a more mature prompt. So there's a platform,
the meta prompting.
So it'll write quite a comprehensive prompt for you if you're new to prompting and you don't structure your prompts. Now you can go to a place that will give you a structured prompt back, and then you paste that into Copilot, right? Making everyone lazier and dumber, right?
Well, let's step through that in a concept. It's like, hey, Copilot, do this for me. So Copilot comes back. Okay, Copilot, tell me how I could have been a better manager. So is it like we're doing a management review every time? Tell me how I could have told you how to do that thing better. Sure.
That's a good idea. That's a good concept of like, how could I have gotten a better result? Just ask Copilot that at the end, you know?
Yeah, ask the employee
Yeah.
that's doing the thing for you. How should I have told you how to do this better?
Yeah. I mean, that's a tactic managers use in like one-on-ones, is like, what can I do for you? How can I, support you better? You know,
I have a
asking Copilot, you
question for
might find
Joe.
something crazy comes back. Yeah.
Joe, you've been saying auto labeling, right? You've been mentioning it a few times around auto labeling. Does it work though? Not technically, but inside of an organization, right? Because I'm not talking about default labeling at a library or a site level. You're talking about actually looking at content inside of a document and then recommending a label that they should use, or automatically applying a label based on content inside of a document. You've mentioned it a few times that functionally that works. I'm worried about the false positives. We've got a simple example, right?
So like pattern matching that
credit card
something as
right?
it's like an ID for a different country.
And the customer retail that we've worked with, their vouchers that they issue is a 16-digit number, right? So from a PCI DSS perspective, yes, lock down 16-digit numbers, but they send out documents with vouchers. Yes, it's over currencies. Auto label policies because of that, the occurrence of a false positive. But you seem quite vocal about this is something that you should do.
Yeah. I would be remiss if I didn't say there is a tremendous amount of work that has to go on your classifiers. A large organization, it's not unreasonable they're going to spend 5 or 6 weeks just honing in on getting the sensitive information types right. This is not we're just going to use the built-in ones and this is going to work beautifully in our environment. No way. You have to spend that time going through that. It's pre-pilot work that you have to go through. That's why this takes a while. And assess what is the content your organization has. Are we getting any false positives there? Are we getting any false negatives there? That takes quite a bit of time. Once you've got that figured out, do you need exact data match? Maybe in that case, I don't know what these voucher numbers are about, but customer numbers, a very common use case for trying to get in front of maybe just using a simple regex for a number format. Sometimes that's just not sufficient. So you got to use some of these other techniques. But yes, there is success, but it comes with a lot of upfront work. And this is why I say, like on the Copilot benefits, anything that deals with time, this is going to save me 11 minutes a day or a week, whatever that is. All of those time savings can be quickly overrun by all of the back end work you have to do to get your house in order so that, you can improve that 11 minutes to maybe 20 minutes. So there's going to be a period of time, I think, that organization-wide, you're going to actually spend more time. You're not going to save time if you have Copilot in-house to get all the Copilot readiness stuff done. And this is a great example. The classifier work, it just takes a lot of time. Yeah.
So we were talking about Copilot readiness, and Jeremy Chapman's ears started tingling. So he's joined us. So we got a sixth person to join. Thanks, Jeremy, for joining us, man.
Is it okay if I crash your Copilot party?
Yeah.
Totally. You've round out our grid. So we're getting closer to Hollywood Squares.
You bring balance to the force.
Nice. If I look up, I can see Darrell.
Yeah.
So welcome to the show, Mr. Microsoft Mechanics, Jeremy Chapman. Jeremy has been here before. So for those of you who haven't been on one of the previous episodes, Jeremy joined John and I last summer to talk about Copilot deployment and some of the backstory there. He's also been on the show for some of our geek talk about all of our gadgets, devices, cameras, and whatnot. So we saw Jeremy hanging out in the chat, and want to welcome him onto our experts panel as we're talking about Copilot readiness.
Thank you. Yeah, and I would say there's been a lot of updates too. I don't know if I joined late, so I might be repeating what you've said, but there's been a lot of updates in terms of admin controls and even the setup guides, and going through some of the best practices in terms of your data estate and preparing that, as you've been talking about for the last 10 minutes or so since I've been watching. But I would say this space is continually evolving and continually getting better, and we're continually listening for feedback and incorporating more controls and more tools and more aspects in terms of the management of Copilot and getting your information in the state where you'll feel good about search. Restricted SharePoint search, I asked in the questions earlier, is one of those things manifested, but even additional visibility that you have, and things like AI Hub and Purview, for example, and others that I think have really been released since certainly since the announcement a year ago, March. But all of these different things that we've done as part of Copilot, preparedness and management, and getting your information estate kind of in a better in a better state itself, so that for generative AI and retrieval augmented generation and orchestration, that it works out kind of more or less to meet your expectations there. And I think a lot of work in terms of the refinement in terms of how search works. And if you go back to, and I'll promote kind of a session that we did with Kirill Gavrilyuk, who runs Cosmos DB. A lot of the work that we've done even there for semantic search, embeddings, indexing, disk ANN, all of that stuff is also to some extent, part of this scenario in terms of how search and how these types of tools are used. The whole vector search space with embeddings and the 300 to 1200 or more dimensions to kind of describe numerically every word that every chunk of data. All of these things lead to better semantic search, and it's cool how the rest of the company is even incorporating these technologies, whether it's Microsoft 365 or Teams or Cosmos DB Team, et cetera, into these different tools that you can use as a company to build your own solutions, obviously, but also benefit from just having Microsoft 365, running and using this innovation that we've been building across the different database stack and different Azure components that we use to run our AI workloads.
So I'm just posting a few of those links that you just mentioned into the chat, so everybody that's kind of joining online can go back and follow up on some of that. So just to kind of quickly get you up to speed, we've been talking about the deployment and the readiness of preparing to deploy Copilot from an information architecture standpoint, from a data governance and compliance standpoint, and from a user adoption and deployment standpoint. We've been kind of filling in some of the gaps, and also pointing out that this is a multifaceted journey that an organization undergoes, because it takes a team really to get the deployment story right, because there's so many different parts there. Some of it's going to be done at the enterprise level and driven from the top down, but some of it's also going to be from the business side of the organization, the owners of the actual data that you're working with. So we've been filling in some of the gaps there, and then tying it back into to Copilot. So right before I think you jumped on, we were kind of going through some of the user adoption journey. And Darrell had said something, and I just want to make sure that we bring this into the conversation. But Darrell had said something around the lines of, when we're using Copilot to prompt against organizational information, and the context of the conversation we were having there was things like duplicate data, redundant, outdated data, kind of cleaning up. But one of the things that Darrell reminded me of was the Copilot amplifies your ability to create content, but it also amplifies your ability to discover new content. And it's a very powerful tool for that. In fact, it really amplifies the delve effect. And I think that's something that we've all kind of felt along the way, where, especially if you're in the information architecture role, you get a call from a C-suite executive or leadership, and they're like, why am I seeing this thing in Delve? Why are these files like showing up? Why are these things showing up in kind of the search results? And it's almost like, because Copilot works with natural language, and it can very easily interpret what you're looking for, even if the terms or the phrases or the terminology is not exact, it can still find and locate that because it's smart enough, it's intelligent enough to be able to do that. So it's important to clean up and organize information, but it's also important to understand that when we're working with something this powerful, that it might surface information that you didn't necessarily know you had access to, that it might surface something that might cause pause for somebody in the organization, because it's really amplifying the Delve effect because of how it's built on top of tools like the semantic index and the Microsoft Graph, and then pulling in information. So I wanted to kind of bring that into the conversation. That's one thing that I've gotten some questions on is this going to be like the new Delve? Am I going to be getting calls from leadership? Am I going to be getting calls from decision makers that are concerned because all of a sudden this file showed up as part of a prompt return inside of a Copilot? And so I just wanted to make sure like we mentioned that. And what kind of feedback do you all have around dealing with that within the organization? Like, what are some of your thoughts around how it can almost provide superpowers within search, provided that it's within your security boundaries and the permissions that you have?
Well, I would say, well, first, the search that you use through Microsoft365.com or other endpoints would yield the same types of results, and it will still use vector search effectively as part of that, because the search engine itself is just continually getting better. So you're still able to use things that are not, exact string matches or exact keyword matches, for example, in search. And that's that type of being able to interpret what you're searching for and find things that are related to it or synonymous or semantically similar to it. That capability is coming through other non-Copilot endpoints as well. So I think one of the first things to look for is like how much of this is available through normal search, and then like you said, it's all based on the user permissions and user level context. A lot of times you'll get kind of the false positive style or false negative, I should say, style of feedback from, say, a leader that might have access to a lot of information because they are a leader and they're searching, like, I see this. You need to search for it under the context of somebody with lower permissions to simulate effectively or test for that permission first. And then when you do see these things, that's when you do need to start putting in place, I would say, like with Microsoft Purview, things that will do automatic classifications, labeling, putting in the right terms effectively for things that you might want to label and block as part of that, just so you've got the right rigor around protecting your files, because they will be discoverable outside of Copilot. Even when Copilot's, not using kind of its different turns to find information through, basically augmenting your prompts, you'll be able to find it through search too. So I do think that probably the most feasible and tangible way to address this at scale is really setting up the right rules around, auto classifications and auto labeling, and then setting up policies that correspond to basically file availability that are predicated on those labels and classifications.
I think you're speaking Joanne's language over there.
Yeah. But you said it a lot better than me, so thanks, Jeremy.
Yeah, I don't know. I didn't hear what you said, so I was late.
So, what I want to, like, we've got about 25 minutes left. I want to kind of pivot a little bit, and we've talked about some of the purview, data classification, governance, a little bit of the information architecture, some of the user adoption. What I'd like to hear is from you all, what are some of the common questions, but also the concerns that you're hearing from organizations that are starting their Copilot readiness journey? What are some of the top of mind things that are potential barriers for them to deploying this like today, or kind of some barriers that are causing them to kind of push the timeline back a little bit? Joanne, you want to kind of take that and
Sure. I mean, this is where I get all of my customers, to be honest with you, because I am a purview compliance specialist. That's my wheelhouse. So they've already made the decision. Yes, we want Copilot, and oh my goodness, how can we get ready for it? So they're coming to me, data protection and data retention, probably on those two main pillars to help protect their content, properly label those containers. How can we build some more better governance, or sometimes just some governance on our Teams and SharePoint site provisioning solution? Often most organizations have really nothing in place for this. Some do, but lots don't. So we can help automate some of those controls. And then on the retention side of the house is let's get rid of some of the data. Often that comes from legal and risk. It's not all of the data is good that's out there. There's massive amounts of unstructured data that needs to be dealt with. So that's another pillar that they reach out to me on. Sometimes they try to do both at the same time, but those are two big pieces in a larger data governance program all up in an organization, but both important for, I think, to be able to leverage and really make use of Copilot all up. So that's my experience. Yeah.
So we're going to take the same question to Alistair. And I know you have a giant list that you're kind of like running from. Maybe give us like your top three. What are like the top three questions, concerns that you're seeing from some of the organizations that think they're ready to start deploying Copilot, or that are looking at getting ready to deploy it?
Access to information is probably the number one thing, right? So, and we've spoken about it, quite a bit around restricted sites and things like that. But what does my Copilot have access to, right? Yeah. You think and I reference the Google search appliance debacle of, circa 2007, right? Or 2008, when Google had a search appliance, you connected it to your network, you expose it to your file share, and, everyone's seeing data about, what people are earning. So what does it have access to? Is Microsoft taking my data? Right, because it's a conversation, right? So is Microsoft storing my data? Where's my data stored when I write a prompt, right? And how accurate is Copilot, which is a big thing, right? That trough of disillusionment, and you were saying earlier, it doesn't get the left brain people are saying, but I ask it the same thing twice and it gives me a different answer. So that's typically the fear that my customers have about, issuing a Copilot license to, an HR person or a finance person, or people that are not in HR and finance, and are they going to see HR data? And you have to reaffirm the concept of security trimming and role-based access control. And if they've got access to the data today, that's the access that Copilot's going to have, right? So it's difficult to go and do this. Everyone gets a Copilot, and we're going to spend the next 3 years fixing our data. It's sort of, you got to define the use case and give that person the Copilot, yeah, and then fix the data. You can't stop them from wanting to use Copilot, and we've had this debate the night before, switching everything on or not switching everything on, right? When people were moving into Microsoft 365. So what do you give people access to? Data security is probably the big one. And then how soon can we give someone a Copilot while we wait to fix the data? We don't want to wait to fix the data because someone saw a demo about Copilot and they want to use it today. Yeah, that's pretty much where I'm at. Switch it on and hope for the best, right? And then fix
switch it on and hope for the best.
Yeah,
Jeremy.
Yeah, I would say that there's also an element of how you prompt Copilot in terms of if you want to get really specific to your file reference, and you do a / command and actually reference the exact file that you want to use. B, like for recency, making sure that you say something like, I only want to use content that has been authored or modified in the last month or the last 2 months or whatever. I think based on kind of the conversation around rot and kind of older stuff, I see that a lot. And these are things where, like, if you do give Copilot a bit more guidance to where it's not pulling up an older file, and it does that to some extent by itself in terms of the logic that's behind the retrieval, but adding that specificity, that's one of the things in Jared Spataro, my skip kind of manager, says this best in terms of the search that you're used to doing through a search engine, and kind of the strings that you're prompting search to do are not the same as what you write in a prompt. And the specificity that you want in your prompt, the more specific you can get, the better basically the completion will be and the response will be for you. And I think that's, like you were saying earlier about middle management and kind of basically prompting people to do things and giving them specificity. You have to kind of think of it like that in the same type of way, where you say, I only want you to surface up things that are maybe from the last 2 weeks and about this topic, give me this tone, et cetera, or specifically reference this file. Then you're going to get better outcomes in general, to where you don't have to continually go back and do multiple shots against the same section, the same set of prompts for that one output that you want. And you're going to get more efficient in the long run in terms of being able to write prompts effectively, asking for multiple things, referencing multiple files, and then that's going to lead to just time savings effect that are better than you'd be able to get just by doing kind of these vague, very high level prompts.
Right,
Look, again, it's the use case, right? And teaching people to become prompt engineers, right? It's always the use case, right? So how can I reduce the opportunity cost associated with producing things, right? And in the old days, it was, the findability, and if you can understand Boolean search operators and fuzzy logic, you can find content faster. I remember watching Tracy van der Schyff do a demo on search where she brought back one result. Because she was looking for a Ducati Monster 696 2017 manual, right? And she always used to demo findability and search. And it's the same thing now, it's just a different tool set with different enablement platforms.
So let's take that same question over to Darrell. What are like your 3 common questions, top concerns that you're hearing from organizations as it relates to Copilot readiness?
It sort of bridges finding where to use it. We've talked a lot about how to prepare our environments from a technical standpoint, making them safe, and making sure that it's going to return sensible data. But key question is, who am I going to give this to get that true return on investment? And sadly, we see typical kind of deployment patterns where we'll give it to IT first, or we'll give it to the executives first. We won't necessarily give assistance with that. And really wanting to try and help people realize that value very quickly. So, that's one question or challenge. And if you're going to do that, you've also got to think, well, how am I going to help them on that journey to realize that value? So how do I help people to help themselves with Copilot? Because we can give them training. We can run little webinars that say, here's how to use it in Word and PowerPoint and Excel and whatever else, or how to craft a great prompt. But until they personalize it and internalize it and make it their own, it's not going to be a regular place to get that value. And it's hard to find those resources to offer that sort of help and coaching. The third thing is really, trying to find that frequent value on a regular basis. Is it that I need to store my prompts somewhere that are working well for me, that I can just go back into my library and drop that into that box and start my day in Copilot? Are there things that are working quite well for us across our business group that address some of our challenges that I can grab that prompt and use it for the weekly or monthly report that does things to compare. Yeah, so those three things, it's like we're investing a lot of money here, you know. It's a 12-month commitment per license. So who do we give it to? How do we help them to find that value and teach themselves to, you know, get that value? And how do they use that on a frequent and regular enough basis for it to become a habit and a true tool?
You're so speaking my language, Darrell. If I could crumple up my sticky note that I put a Mac OS sticky note on here and put my three things, and Darrell just like stole all of them or most of them. It's been very much that we speak we're on the same frequency. For me, number one initially was the fear of oversharing, and you know, the data. What about the data and things coming back? I will say that has been very largely unfounded in my own experience. It's different for different organizations, but we've gone very well out of our way to put a report your concerns process in front of people. We remind them that it's there. Every single onboarding, we slap the link all over the place. We put it on Viva Engage. It's front and center, and it's been like, I think maybe it's still single digit of people who have actually reported like a real instance of like something that they found they shouldn't have had access to. So that's good. Transcription concerns are the second one for some organizations that I've heard from. And that's around the most value. I think most people would agree the most value comes from using Copilot with your Teams meetings. And oh my gosh, it's like magic that you get this recap tab and you know when you were mentioned and all of that. The transcript is required to enable a lot of that. So people who or organizations who haven't been comfortable with transcription, that's a little bit of a hurdle to overcome. And the questions around that mainly have been around, can we notify people properly that they're being captured? Or even if we're not doing the permanent transcription, we're just doing the ephemeral temporary, can we notify people that what they say might be used in a Copilot response? Can we make sure that transcript goes away properly? Those are tools that are still coming. I think they're right on the cusp on the roadmap for being able to remove transcripts the way we can, have retention policies to remove the recording files properly. And just organizations thinking like, can they accept the risk of turning it on? So the third one, to Darrell's point, just on value prop as a category, has been, if we're not comfortable with transcription, is it worth turning it on? Are we going to get that X dollar value per month out of this if they can't use like the 60-70% value prop with transcription? Who do we give it to? As Darrell mentioned, that kind of like we've done pilots where we've intentionally had many different segments of leadership and also like different types of job roles to find out who gets the most value out of it. And then the third one of those value prop questions has been, how do I get people to keep using it? Something that I've seen in the wild is it's almost like Siri. I hope I didn't wake her up. Or it's like VR, where you get this new VR headset, you put it on, and then a month later, everybody's meta quests are gathering dust right now. And it's like the newness and excitement of getting this new thing, Copilot, wears off for people. And I've kind of seen this tank off of like, we put so much effort into onboarding and enablement that I would encourage change managers and people who fund adoption programs to make sure that you carry people beyond the level one and beyond the onboarding, because a lot of times like it's this muscle that you haven't exercised. So you either forget to use it or you don't go out of your way to use it as much. So that's been a question that has come up with groups that I've discussed with, is like, how do I make sure that people use it for 12 months instead of just using it for the first 6 weeks and then forgetting it exists, like I forget series on my phone because it's almost too embedded, But those are just things that I've been thinking. I'm curious, Andy, what's your top 3 questions you're hearing? Because you're turning on multiple tenants now within your organization.
Yeah, so I'm deep in deployment across a few different tenants with it, but I still get some of the public perspective and feedback through TechCon 365 and participating there. Um, for me, the thing that people ask first, it always deals with data privacy and security. Is my data secure? How is Copilot actually using my data? But once the organization actually makes the decision to deploy it and start working with it, I've found that the data privacy and security talk in many cases takes a back seat to number one, how do we measure a return on this investment? So we start to deploy this thing. We put a lot of effort into our onboarding process. We put a lot of effort into our training and getting it out there to the organization. Then leadership wants us to be able to go back and measure the return on that investment. Okay, people are using this, but is it worth it for us to pay this amount per person if all they're going to do is summarize meetings and generate meeting notes and summarize email? So it's that adoption journey, which I think is kind of the next like big pillar. So figuring out the ROI on a personal end user perspective, and then transitioning that to a team-based perspective. I think that's kind of the second big part of that, the adoption journey, is can we take this from personal productivity to team-based productivity and start to see a positive impact on things like productivity and efficiency in the organization. Not that we're looking to reduce headcount, but what we're looking to do is optimize our business processes so that maybe we can get this process done more efficiently with a little bit less effort, remove some of the redundancy of that process, and free these information workers up for things like decision making and creative endeavors. So that one, that transition from personal productivity into the team-based productivity, I think is kind of like the second big bullet point for me, is how do we as a team start to make the most out of this? And then how can like we actually measure that? Like coming up with reporting around that has been a little bit of a challenge. We've had to create some of our own like reports and some of our own kind of surveys and adoption materials around that. And then kind of the other question around that is, do you quantify this in like dollars that a process costs like per hour, or do you like quantify this in like the amount of time that it takes like per person or like per team in order to accomplish this? And so there's like different ways to measure it, and you have to figure out which metric's going to work for like what you're trying to measure. And then the third one for me is really the user adoption journey. And John, this kind of is going to go back to like what you said, the Gartner hype curve for AI. I really see the effects of that in the organization. So there's, that initial excitement. Copilot's awesome. There's this new tool. It's saving me a lot of time. But if they aren't learning how to talk to Copilot, if they're not learning how to prompt, if they're not learning how to ask questions of Copilot, if they're not learning that you need to set a goal and the context and give it a source and provide it direction and the outcome and the format of the information, they're only going to do things like summarize meetings and generate meeting notes. It's when you're able to get down in the weeds with those users and adapt it to their processes and the things that they use every day, and then show them, hey, we can prompt this and make this like a one shot, and you can get much better results out of this. It's when you start doing that you start see some of that trough of disillusionment start to go back up toward that slope of productivity. And that's been like the real challenge, is keeping people engaged enough with it to use it every day, to fit it into some team-based processes, and to start to drive ROI off of that. Now, granted, I'm not on the information architecture side of the house. I'm not on the data privacy side of the house. I'm a user adoption specialist. That's what I do. So I'm trying to connect people to a purpose. And right now the purpose is, let's maximize what we can do with this. But a lot of that's coming from leadership. So those are kind of like the three big things that I see. But I can tell you, having delivered a few workshops around this, once you start engaging with other organizations, very quickly you realize they're starting to see and get asked some of the same questions, but it always comes out first, data privacy and security. And once you start getting into like how to use it, then that conversation starts to change a little bit.
To your point, Andy, I wish I had an army of people who could sit down with every user to be like, hey, let's take one thing that you do. Tell me the 2 things that you hate about doing it. And then let's together figure out how we could, like lighten that load by using Copilot to do like just a step, And I think a lot of leadership are expecting, they've seen the sizzle reels and they've heard all the hype from not just Microsoft, but every company about how this is going to transform your workforce. And it's like, I feel like the light bulb doesn't go off until you could sit with somebody and be like, let's make a baby step in the right direction and have them be like, wow, that's great. And like get a win so that they want to try it for something else and kind of build up to it. I wish I had just like dozens of people to do that for people to
Maybe
help them
that'll be
realize.
Copilot agents out here in the near future. We can agent scale ourselves out into some of those processes.
Like you said, that team benefit, that next level of personal productivity to now, how do I enable my team to be more productive? I think your leveling up has really matched what has been announced with Team Copilot, right? And that might be what Microsoft has been thinking, is that, hey, once like the table stakes are done and everybody's using this personally, how do we use it like across collaboration? A lot of organizations might be running into that, and now there's something for them.
So let's take that same question, and now I'd like to hear Jeremy's perspective on kind of the 3 biggest questions, feedback, concerns that you're getting from organizations as it relates to Copilot readiness.
I'll flip it a little bit, because I kind of think there are almost like 3 stages of almost Copilot enlightenment, where you'll have people that are pretty new to it. Maybe they've tried things like ChatGPT, or they've tried Copilot consumer, the consumer facing versions, and they know that it can generate text for them. So, and then you get there, those folks generally are like kind of using the term Copilot and ChatGPT almost like Kleenex or Coke or one of those kind of words where it just kind of means everything for generative text AI. And then a lot of people that are kind of in that camp, in that earlier stage, are thinking, well, Copilot in the Microsoft 365 apps means I can do text generation inside of Word or PowerPoint or somewhere else. So I think once you get past that and you realize, okay, I can use it now against things that are open, and that's kind of the docked. If you watch Stevie Batish's build presentation from like a year ago, there's kind of like the docked Copilot to the side. That's kind of like the second stage. So then at that point you're like, okay, I've got a file open that's on the left of my screen, but I've got a right pane or something on the right side that can now interact with that document. So now I can actually reference things that are on my screen. That's pretty cool. And then kind of the third phase is, wait a second, I've got this basically this chat prompt that can find information in SharePoint or elsewhere, on OneDrive, for example. Or if you use extensions, you can use APIs, or you can use graph connectors. And I can actually have it go and find information from those sources, bring that back, and then create me something based on my data. And usually, like, it takes a while to get to that third stage of, oh wow, I can prompt and ask things sometimes without even referencing the files directly and get those to return. But I would say a lot of people are still kind of between stages 1 and 2, and not as many people. When you get to stage 3, that's when I think the data privacy and the governance and all of those kind of concerns start to light up. So as I talk to anyone, I've got to kind of like quiz them a little bit and figure out what stage they are in terms of like where their level of generative AI kind of knowledge is, retrieval augmented generation, orchestration knowledge. Then at that point, like everyone who's on this call, you guys have been doing this for so long, I can talk to you at stage 3, but you can't project that onto every single person you talk to, because a lot of people just have different levels of experience with the various generative AI tools that they've tried. So you kind of have to quiz that out, tease it out, and then go after the right kind of conversation based on where they are. And that's the listening element, I think, of trying to figure out where people are and meet them where they are in terms of addressing any concerns or any feedback that they have.
That's a really interesting perspective, a different way to look at it. As you're saying that, I'm thinking about some of my users coming to me and they're like, well, this is how I do it in Chat GPT. And I'm like, well, you have to, think about it a little bit differently over here. There's a data boundary based off of like what, the graph can return, and you're working with data that's internal versus like you haven't flipped the switch to, enable like web search and, things like that. So I'm hearing a lot of those conversations playing back through my head as you're describing that. So that was a nice twist on the perspective there. So we are at the top of hour number 2. We were scheduled for 2 hours, and I don't want to take up any extra time from all of our guests here today. I do thank everybody for being here and for learning out loud with John and I. I know this 2 hours has really flown by. I've learned a ton. I'm really excited to actually go back and revisit some of the conversation, as well as all the links that I sent out based off of all the things that you've all mentioned throughout. I just want to kind of go around the room, and as we're wrapping up here, I'll start with Joanne. Can you tell us how people can reach you, and maybe where you're going to be next, where you're speaking at next?
Sure. Thanks for having me. I learned a lot today. So interesting to hear the perspective. So I appreciate that. You can reach me at my blog, joanneklein.com. All my contact information is there. I blog about Purview compliance and SharePoint Premium mostly. And next speaking event is TechCon 365 in DC in August. So thanks for having me.
I will see you in DC. Looking forward to it, Joanne. Thank you. Alistair.
It's in the name. You can find me at Alistair Pugin, Two Guys in SharePoint podcast we've been doing since 2016. And everything that you need to know about data governance, you go to Joe.
No, and you.
No. I've created like a fan base of people that just look out for her infographics, right? She does these things, and it's like, oh my God, there's a new one, right? But definitely, I do some of the stuff that Joe does, but I can't classify what I do. I get people excited about tech. That's it, really. And you can find me on Twitter. It's the easiest place, at Alistair Pugin.
Any speaking engagements coming up?
No, I canceled some of my international travel because I was dealing with my mom. And I'll get back into the speaker circuit probably later on this year.
All right. Let us know. We're happy to share.
Awesome.
All right. Darrell.
Oh, well, look for me at Darrell Webster. There's a couple of people that have got the same spelling. There's a lawyer. I think there's someone who makes chocolates and someone else in sports. But yeah, if you find them, then that's not me. I'm also Darrell as a service, although I think that's wearing thin now. We've got Copilot out there that's far more scalable. I still create content on a YouTube channel. It's a mixed bag of content, and I get together with friends occasionally and do things like this. You'll find me also lurking here in the monthly shows with John and Andy, often trying to do crazy things in the chat, even to the point of didn't we do like a loop training session via chat? And oh my goodness.
We had a deep dive going, and you had a loop training session happening in the YouTube chat at the same time.
And we very much appreciate you, Darrell. He won't call this out himself, but congratulate him in the chat. He just reached 10,000 subscribers on his YouTube channel.
After 10 years.
Nice.
So great job, Darrell. And Jeremy, how about you? Where can we find you?
Well, the main channel is at Microsoft Mechanics, at MSFT Mechanics on X, and we're on LinkedIn and YouTube, of course. And I do have what I call my baby channel that's on YouTube, that's at Deploy Jeremy, where I do a lot of gadget reviews and things, work from home tips, software tips. I was thinking about, I just got a Copilot Plus PC that I paid for with my own money, by the way, but I swapped in a 2 terabyte drive. And there were some different learnings along the way where the getting the drive and the device working didn't quite match what was documented in terms of how to do it. So I was thinking about posting that, but I've been posting quite a bit of other kind of content around screen recording and various other things lately. So at Deploy Jeremy or at MSFT Mechanics, you'll find me.
Awesome.
Well, keep us posted when you post that. I'm interested to see and learn from that. I'm really curious about the new Copilot plus PCs and the ARM architecture over there.
It's a bit different because I don't know if you know that I spent 10 years of my life, well, more than that actually, if you go before I joined Microsoft, but I was doing Windows deployments before I came to Microsoft, and then ran the kind of the Windows deployment kind of IT Pro marketing side and the solution accelerator team. I was there before doing the marketing side of like building out business desktop deployment, Microsoft deployment toolkit. So I've probably installed Windows more than 10,000 times, no lie, manually, like at the device. When you take away the kind of system center, pushing it out to lots of different devices.
And falling out of a plane too, Jeremy.
What's that?
Installing Office while falling out of a plane.
Right. I used to have a WDS server running Pixie at my house, believe it or not. Anyway, so I was very versed in all of that. So doing this kind of work to me is really exciting, and I thought part of it was even getting the image. It's a split WIM set of files. It's got to fit on FAT32, so all the files have to be under 4 gigabytes. It's about 12.8 or 12.7 gigs of image because it's got the 51 plus different ML models plus Florence plus the different 5 small language models as well that are included as part of the image. And so getting that was a bit of a new, a different experience. I'm used to like 6 gigabyte images, split WIMs as well, but that one's a little bit larger. And then kind of how you work through it, because you need basically a FAT32 drive that's natively between 16 and 32 gigs, which is pretty common. And then once you do that, you can basically swap in a new SSD and recover it effectively with recovery media. So it took me a little bit of fighting because I only had 64 and 128 gig USB thumb drives, but eventually I found an older one that was 16 to 32 and figured it out. So
that's awesome. That sounds like it'll be a good video.
So don't buy V1, right?
What's that?
Don't buy V1.
Yes. And well, the other thing that's cool with the new Surfaces, by the way, is the Pros have the trap door in the back that you can just get the SSD out with a T5 Torx bit, but the laptops, it used to be that the kind of keyboard section would lift off with the clamshell open. Now you can just leave it clamshell down closed and suction cup off the bottom panel after you release the 4 different T5 screws. And then you've got your SSD right there. It's so easy to just basically service the Surface, different devices now that it's been night and day compared to just a few years ago. So kudos to the engineers, Jochen, and all of the people that worked on laptop and in Pro, because they're so much more accessible and easy to get inside of and swap out components now than they ever have been.
Well, now that you've sold us on the video, you have to make it. So let us know whenever you get that video, and we'll amplify it.
Okay, we'll do.
Jeremy, how soon do you think there's going to be feature parity? Like with Apple Silicon, you have Snapdragon Silicon. And do you see that feature parity for platforms? I'm on an M2 Mac, and by the time I bought this, everything was already available from an optimized sort of architecture for application architecture for the CPU. I mean, you've obviously got a Snapdragon architecture now.
Right.
What is the sort of window? Can you predict the window for? Because I'd love to buy a new device, Windows specifically, but is it going to be ready? When is it going to be ready where most apps have now been ported to Snapdragon architecture?
So one, I would say from an emulation standpoint, Prism is way better. I can't feel the difference really between an ARM64 and an AMD 64 process if it's a normal process. The things where I do notice a few things would be like if you're using things like virtual cameras or you have virtual audio tracks where you're multiplying like your microphone or your camera feeds, etc. Those are the types of things, because we do a lot of video and streaming as you guys all do. Those are the kind of things where, because it's more of a driver level thing, it doesn't always work, but the apps themselves work really well. And then you're seeing more and more things get to be native ARM64 effectively. I would say though, just because there is chip versus like Mac OS, because there is the different chipset diversity in terms of natively compiling all the apps I would say it's relatively far along, but it's going to take some time before everybody is natively compiling those packages as ARM packages. But I think in the interim, like from a compat level, it's really, really good using the emulation for any, I would say, normal app that 99% of the population would use. It's just those things that, like I said, if you're doing like virtual camera or virtual mic feeds or those types of things, working through a few of those different driver things might take a little bit of time, but I have a feeling it's going to be there pretty soon. So I wouldn't have any hesitation in terms of using one or recommending one now, because I'm kind of on a little bit of the oddball spectrum in terms of some of my device and driver needs, but most people with printers and kind of normal peripherals are going to have no problems.
Okay, perfect. So you recommend buying one now?
I had to, because of basically because I wanted to test it out with the the 45 tops and all the NPU, or getting everything offloaded to those, doing the video edit, because I know that the Mac is a great, like for upscaling and stuff, Mac does really well now, and I want to make sure that I try this out on a Copilot Plus PC that's got the NPU. So I wanted, just out of my own curiosity, that's why, like I said, I bought the device as my own personal device. I had to have one, so I ordered the 20th of May or whenever when we announced them, and it just arrived like 2 days ago. I got the blue laptop.
Cool. Well, I think that's it for this time. I have just a little bit of housekeeping reminder that we are consolidating 365 Deep Dive onto our singular channel on YouTube and LinkedIn starting next month. So we're going to start, that unified feed over there. And to echo what Andy said, I want to thank you guys for all coming on. I wish I could drop myself down to like a third row so that I could have all of this Mount Rushmore of Hall of Famers that, I've looked up to you all for so long, for so many years. And it's a privilege to be able to talk to you. And I've learned a whole lot over the past 2 hours. So I guess without anything else, thank you all for sticking with us and watching for the past 2 hours. If you're in the US, I hope you have a great 4th of July holiday. I'm looking forward to taking 2 weeks off, and we'll see you next month. I think we're going to talk about Prompt Buddy probably. So I think that'll be a really fun one.
Yep. Same. Thanks everybody for being here. Thanks everybody for joining in online, and we will see you in July for the next 365 Deep Dive. Take care, everybody.
Cheers.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Thanks again. Bye.